The man in the back seat. It was past midnight, the kind of late where everything is quiet, too quiet. A young woman was driving home after a long shift at work. The roads were mostly empty, just the soft hum of her engine and the flicker of streetlights passing overhead. She wasn't in a rush, just tired and ready to be home. She noticed the car behind her just a few minutes after merging onto the main highway. It came out of nowhere, just suddenly there, headlights bright in her mirror, driving too close. She tapped her brakes a little, hoping the driver would back off. They didn't. Instead, the car stayed on her tail, not just following, but sticking unnervingly close. Then the flashing started. Headlights, on, off, on again. A few seconds later, another flash. It wasn't random. It felt deliberate, aggressive. She switched lanes. The car followed. She sped up. So did they. Every time she tried to create space, they closed the gap again. It wasn't just annoying. It was starting to feel threatening. She thought maybe it was a drunk driver or someone playing a stupid prank. Either way, she needed to lose them. She took the next exit, hoping they'd keep going straight. But the car followed her off the ramp. Now it was obvious. This wasn't a coincidence. Her mind raced through worst-case scenarios. Was she being targeted? Was someone trying to run her off the road? She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal on this stretch of road. She scanned ahead and saw a small gas station just off the intersection. A rundown, low-lit place with a single pump and an old booth with a flickering open sign. She pulled in sharply and parked near the building, hoping to get inside and maybe call for help. The other car pulled in right behind her, parking awkwardly at an angle. The headlights stayed on. She stepped out of her car, heart pounding, ready to run into the store. But before she could even reach the door, the gas station attendant burst out of the booth. "Get in here," he shouted. She hesitated, caught off guard by the urgency in his voice. "Now," he barked again, more forcefully. She ran toward him, and he yanked her inside the store, locking the door behind her. The man was pale, out of breath, and clearly shaken. She started to speak, but he cut her off. "Forget that car," he said. "There's someone in your backseat." At first, she didn't understand. "What are you talking about?" The attendant pointed out toward her car. "That other driver, he's not following you. He was trying to warn you. He saw someone moving in your backseat while you were driving." Everything froze in her mind for a second. That backseat, her backseat, she hadn't checked. She hadn't even thought to. "I saw it too," the attendant added. "When you pulled in, something moved back there. I wasn't sure if it was a pet but the guy in that other car looked terrified." She felt sick. Her legs went cold. She'd been driving for over 20 minutes, completely unaware that someone might have been crouched behind her the entire time. The attendant was already on the phone with the police. They stayed inside, watching from the booth. The man in the other car stayed parked nearby, hands on the wheel, watching her vehicle like a hawk. He didn't leave. He didn't try to approach. He was just waiting, still alert, still watching. When the police finally arrived, they approached her car cautiously, flashlights out, guns drawn. They opened the driver's side door first, then the rear door. And there he was, a man, disheveled, silent, holding a large folding knife. He'd been crouched on the floor behind the front seats, completely hidden from view. He didn't resist arrest. He didn't speak, just stared blankly as they pulled him from the car and handcuffed him on the spot. The officers later said it was clear he'd been waiting for the right moment. Maybe when she stopped at a light, maybe when she got home. No one knew how long he'd been in the car, but the assumption was that he'd slipped in earlier that evening while the car was parked outside her workplace. No one saw him do it. No one heard a thing. The doors weren't damaged. She must have left them unlocked. A simple mistake, one that almost cost her life. Later, when they searched the man's belongings, they found zip ties, a cloth rag, and a small bottle of something unmarked. Whatever his plan was, it wasn't just theft. He hadn't come for her wallet. He'd come for her. She stayed at the gas station for hours that night, shaken, barely able to speak. The man in the other car, the one who'd followed her, stayed until it was over. When the police thanked him, he said only one thing. Eventually, she made it home safely. But she never forgot that night. The fear didn't fade. It followed her everywhere. Every time she got into her car, she checked the back seat. Every time she parked, she locked the doors immediately. Every time a car pulled up behind her at night, her heart still skipped a beat. She'd always thought danger was something you'd see coming. Something loud, obvious. But this wasn't that. This was quiet, hidden, and far too close. And if it weren't for a stranger who decided to follow her, not to harm, but to help, she might not have survived the night. Sometimes, the real threat isn't the one chasing you down the road. It's the one already sitting behind you. It was just after midnight in a quiet residential suburb, one of those neighborhoods where nothing usually happens. The streets were still, porch lights flickered across empty driveways, and most houses had gone dark hours ago. Inside one of those homes, a teenage boy was alone. His parents had gone out of town for the weekend to attend a family event. He had opted to stay behind. He wasn't a little kid anymore, and he figured one night alone wasn't a big deal. The house was locked up. He had snacks, his phone, and a few horror movies queued up. It felt routine, familiar. By the time it hit midnight, he had started dozing off on the couch. The glow from the TV lit up the living room in flickers. Nothing was happening on screen, just background noise, half-watched scenes. That's when he heard the knock. It was sharp, 3 hard knocks on the front door. Not a doorbell, not a gentle tap, just that solid, deliberate sound. He sat up straight, alert now. He wasn't expecting anyone, especially not this late. He turned down the TV and listened. Another knock. Same rhythm, same force. Nothing frantic, nothing panicked, just steady and strange. He got up slowly and made his way toward the hallway. The front door had a small peephole, and he pressed his eye to it. There was a man standing on the porch, early 40s maybe, unshaven, wearing a hoodie with the hood pulled up, and hands buried in his pockets. No phone, no car, no sign of distress. Just standing there, still. The boy didn't open the door. He called out through the wooden frame, trying to keep his voice steady. "Can I help you?" "Yeah," the man replied calmly. "Sorry to bother you. My car broke down a few blocks back. I just need to use your phone for a second. That's all." The boy didn't respond immediately. Something about the man's voice felt wrong. Not what he said, but how he said it. Too calm, too flat, like he'd rehearsed it. It wasn't how someone stranded in a strange neighborhood should sound. Still, he didn't want to be rude. "I'm sorry," he said. "I can't let anyone in. Try another house." There was a pause. The man didn't move. "Come on, man," he said again. "It'll take 2 minutes. Just one call." But the boy stayed quiet. His instinct was pushing him hard now. Something was off. He moved a step back from the door. He could still see the man through the peephole, still standing there, still not leaving. Then the man spoke again. His tone had changed. Lower now, less friendly. "I can see you in there." The boy's stomach dropped. The hallway light was off. The curtains were closed. There was no way this man could see him, but he said it so confidently, like it was a fact. And that made it worse. That kind of confidence doesn't come from a guess. It comes from control. The boy stepped back, heart pounding now. He grabbed his phone and called his parents first. Just instinct. He told them quickly what was happening. They told him to stay calm and call the police. He hung up and dialed emergency services. His voice was shaking as he explained the situation, but the dispatcher stayed calm and told him officers were already en route. While he was still on the call, he heard something. Metal scraping. He crept back toward the front window and gently pulled back the curtain. The man was no longer on the porch. He was walking around the side of the house. The boy ducked and backed into the hallway. He could hear faint noises now. Footsteps in the gravel near the side gate, then the soft rattle of a door handle being tested. He moved quickly to lock the back door, just in case he hadn't already. Then came tapping. Not a knock, just a light tapping on the kitchen window. He froze. The tapping continued, soft and rhythmic, like the man was just letting him know he was still out there. "Open the door," the man said again, quieter now. "I know you're alone." The boy crouched behind the counter, phone still in his hand, barely breathing. The dispatcher was still on the line, still giving instructions, but his mind was elsewhere, focused on every sound, every movement outside. Then another noise, this time louder, a crack. Then the sound of shattering glass. The kitchen window had been broken. He ran, locked himself in the bathroom. He barricaded the door with his foot and kept the phone pressed to his ear. He didn't know if the man was inside the house now. He didn't know where he was or how fast the police could get there. Every second dragged. Then, finally, sirens. He heard them before he saw the lights. Red and blue flashing through the bathroom window. Car doors slamming. Officers shouting commands. When he finally unlocked the door and came out, the house was crawling with police. But the intruder was gone. The broken kitchen window was real. The footprints around the house were real, but there was no trace of the man. Officers searched the yard, then the street, then the small wooded trail behind the house. Nothing. The man had vanished. A few hours later, police told him something else. He wasn't the only one. There had been 2 other calls that night. Same description, same method. A man knocking on doors, asking to use the phone, then trying to break in. In one case, he'd gotten inside before the homeowner chased him out. No one had been hurt yet, but the pattern was clear. Someone was targeting quiet homes late at night, waiting for the right opening. The man was never caught. There were no fingerprints, no name, no solid lead, just a vague description and a string of close calls. The boy's parents came home the next morning. He hadn't slept. He didn't speak much for the first few days. He just kept replaying everything. The knock, the voice, the tapping, the moment the glass broke. He never stayed home alone after that. Not once. He stopped answering knocks at the door altogether. He installed a security system. Cameras, motion lights, alarms. But even with all that, something stayed with him. Because it hadn't started with a break-in. There hadn't been any screaming, no forced entry, at least not at first. It had started with something small. A knock, a voice that sounded just calm enough to pass for normal. That was the worst part. How easily it had almost worked. It started as just another hike. A solo hiker, mid-30s, experienced and comfortable in the woods, had decided to spend a quiet weekend on the trails. He wasn't new to this. He'd hiked solo plenty of times before. He knew the routes, packed light but smart, and chose a remote forest trail that looped through the hills and dense woodland before circling back to the starting point. It was a path rarely used, far enough off the map to be quiet, but not so deep as to be risky. He parked at the trailhead around mid-afternoon. There were no other cars around. That wasn't unusual. This trail didn't draw many people, and that was part of the appeal. He strapped on his pack, locked the car, and started walking. For the first hour, everything was typical. Birds in the canopy, the crunch of boots on the dirt path, the low hum of wind moving through tall trees. He followed the markers, kept a steady pace, and planned to reach his usual camping spot by early evening. Then he saw the man. It happened just past a bend in the trail, a figure sitting on a rock near the edge of the path, quietly eating from a small metal container. He looked up as the hiker approached and nodded. "Evening," the man said. He looked to be in his 40s, thin, pale, wearing an old backpack and mismatched outdoor gear. Not a threat on the surface, nothing strange, just another person on the trail. The hiker nodded back. Evening. They exchanged a few quick words, just trail talk. The man said he'd been hiking since early morning. Said he was heading the same direction, but moving slow. His voice was calm, polite. Nothing in the conversation stood out. After a few minutes, the hiker continued on. But maybe 10 minutes later, something started to nag at him. He hadn't heard the man walking behind him. No footfall, no movement, just silence. It was odd, considering the trail was narrow and lined with dry leaves and loose gravel. Even slow hikers made some noise. He stopped for a moment, listening. Nothing. Eventually, he shook it off. Not everyone walks at the same pace. Maybe the man had decided to take a break or turn back. He kept going. Another 30 minutes passed. He was getting close to his planned campsite, just a small flat clearing near a creek he'd used before. But as he came around another bend, his heart stopped. The man was there. He was standing just off the path, facing away, looking out toward the trees. There was no way he could have gotten ahead. The trail didn't branch, and the hiker had kept a steady pace without stopping. The man hadn't passed him. He was sure of it. The terrain didn't allow for shortcuts, and even if it did, there was no sound, no rustling, no movement. The man turned and nodded again. "Thought I'd get a bit of distance in before sundown," he said casually. The hiker nodded back, said nothing, and kept walking. But now the feeling had shifted. Something was wrong. That calm he'd felt earlier was gone. His pace quickened, and he decided to camp elsewhere, somewhere less exposed. He cut off from the main trail, pushing through some undergrowth until he found a small ridge surrounded by dense trees. It wasn't ideal, but it was off-path and hard to spot unless you knew where to look. He set up camp quickly, just a tarp shelter and a fire pit. As night came on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. He kept checking over his shoulder, scanning the trail through gaps in the trees. Later that night, he walked back toward the trail for a quick check before turning in. That's when he saw it. Boot prints, fresh, in the dirt, headed toward his campsite, then veering away again. Someone had come close, too close. He walked back, slowly, quietly, checked his pack. His gear looked untouched, mostly, but a few things were out of place. His water bottle had been moved. A zipper on his pack wasn't fully closed. Nothing was missing, but it felt deliberate, like someone had looked through his things just enough to be noticed. He didn't sleep much that night. He kept the fire low, kept a light near his hand, and listened. At first light, he packed up fast and got back on the trail. But again, less than an hour later, he saw the man. This time, the man wasn't on the trail. He was off to the side, deeper in the trees, half hidden behind a thick cluster of brush. He wasn't walking. He was just standing there, watching. The hiker didn't stop. He didn't speak. He kept walking, pretending he hadn't seen him. But his mind was racing. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. This was deliberate. He changed his plan. No camping again. No overnight. He was going to hike straight through and get out by nightfall. The rest of the trail was long and rough, but it was doable in one push if he moved quickly. He didn't stop for food, barely paused for water, but the feeling of being watched never left him. Every turn, every ridge, he expected to see that same pale face again. And he did, 2 more times. Once ahead of him again, somehow, just standing near a fallen log, not even pretending to be a fellow hiker anymore. And once off to the side of the trail, sitting on a stump like he was waiting for something. No words, no gestures, just eye contact. By late afternoon, the hiker left the trail entirely. He cut downhill, pushing through thorns and branches, ignoring the map, just following the terrain until he hit a fire road. He followed that road for hours until it led him to a ranger station. When he got there, he reported everything. What he saw, where he saw it, what the man looked like, how many times he'd appeared. Rangers took it seriously. They asked questions, took notes, and sent a team out to check the trail. But they found nothing. No sign of anyone matching the description. No campfire remains. No discarded gear. Nothing but a few boot prints they couldn't trace. A few weeks later, the hiker received a call from one of the rangers. Other hikers had come forward with similar reports. Someone matching that same description appearing along remote trails, watching, following, never engaging directly, just appearing and vanishing. There were no attacks, no clear crimes, just strange, unsettling encounters with a man no one could explain. The hiker never went back to that trail. He still hikes, but only in groups and never in unfamiliar areas. Because sometimes the threat isn't loud. It doesn't scream or chase or strike suddenly. Sometimes it's patient. It waits. It watches. It learns your pace, your habits, your route. And it stays just close enough to make sure you know it's there, but never close enough to prove it.